I'm sorry, I didn't get that. Yeah, please. Are you ready to jump in, or would you prefer Carlos goes first? Okay, so let's do it like that, yeah.
Sorry, we have a couple of minutes to debate.
Yeah, so I was even quicker than I jumped the gun. So we have three nice presentations today, all dealing with different aspects of youth employment policy. A general review of the youth employment situation in Ethiopia and an assessment of the youth employment strategy, youth employment policy in that country. Then we have Carlos Gamito, who will actually start talking about I guess what the sort of a lot of people are focused on, the impact evaluation of youth labour market program in Guinea-Bissau, and then we'll have Ariane Deloy, who will talk about a youth guarantee, a kind of guarantee approach, sort of modelled on the EU youth guarantee, sort of more comprehensive approach to dealing with young people who are in need. This is an approach that we're pushing a lot in the ILO. This type of guarantee approach, which has sort of picks up on a lot of the findings of the meta-analysis and findings on impact evaluations from the past, where this idea of tailored interventions and comprehensive interventions, sort of more, let's say, articulated interventions to deal with to try and guarantee young people some kind of support in their entry to the labour market, or young people who are don't manage to affect the school to work transition, let's say, independently or without support, and particularly more vulnerable young people, and how these different elements can be brought together. And in fact, this is a really interesting initiative in South Africa, whereby research has met actually policy. So in fact, SALDRU have been actively engaged in implementing pilots of this youth guarantee approach. So anyway, there are lots to look forward to. With that, I'll hand the floor to Carlos Gamito, who's going to talk to us a little bit. Are we ready?
It's on the thing, but colleagues online can see it. Okay.
1 second. As they say, technical problems. Technological change brings with it technological problems.
I always say that sometimes they create more problems than they solve. Technology should make our life easier.
Okay, so without further ado, we're now ready to kick things off. As I said, at the end of the presentation, we'll allow a minute or two for questions. So without further ado, I'll hand over the floor to Carlos Gamito. Over to you.
Thank you, Neil, for the warm presentation. I would like to start thanking the ILO, the government of Canada, include for organizing this event, bringing me here to Geneva for the first time. I also would like to express my gratitude to the other presenters for their insightful presentations, from which I pick up a lot of ideas for future research. And now I would like to introduce you to the results from an impact evaluation of activation policies in Guinea-Bissau. The presentation is divided in 6 sections. I will start by giving you a little bit of the context and the design of the intervention. Guinea-Bissau is a West African country with an estimated population of 2 million people. And it was the first country to gain independence from Portugal in 1973 among the CPLP countries. Still, since then, there has been a lot of political instability, endemic fragility, and recurrent episodes of violence and civil conflicts that have hit the country. This resulted in lack of socioeconomic development despite all the international support, as you can see by the figures in the slides. Still today, Guinea-Bissau is below WAEMU standards in terms of decent work, with almost 50% of workers earning a salary below the national minimum wage. And that's why we implemented the Générer des opportunités de travail sur la route Guinée-Bissau, Senegal, Mali, or GOT, which aimed at enhancing decent work conditions for youth to prevent irregular migration, because all this lack of decent work opportunities for the youth has triggered narco-traffic and irregular migration in Guinea-Bissau. The project enrolled vulnerable youth in 3 different tracks and 10 areas of vocational training, all of them combining an integrated approach that resorted to cash transfers together with activation measures. The first track provided vouchers for TVET training. The second track provided classroom training, but at the TVET center of the NGO implementing the program, plus on-the-job training. And the third track provided the same classroom training, plus incentives for entrepreneurship promotion. And the design of the intervention built on the experimental literature to maximize impact. Indeed, we used a lot the work from Susanna and Kluwe, that famous meta-analysis to design the intervention, including different things like the duration above 5 months, mentoring and profiling, different components, and these things that you can find in the meta-analysis. Now, I encountered many methodological challenges when conducting the evaluation, and this is typical in any impact evaluation, but I resorted to the econometric toolbox to cope with them. To start with, the sample size was relatively small, only 302 individuals, although the reality is that they are double because there were 2 time periods. I would like to reassure you about the internal validity of the results, because we applied the randomized control framework, and this is the golden rule for impact evaluations. But who are we talking about here? So the average individual in our sample was a man of 25 years old, earning 21 euros per month, and with an employment probability of 24%, with 11 years of schooling and living in a household with another 10 members with an average income of 131 euros per month. So as you can see, very vulnerable people. we had an issue with imperfect compliance. So some of the individuals did not respect the allocation to the treatment or control group. That's why I estimated two things. I estimated intention to treatment effects, or what was the impact of the intervention on the individuals as originally allocated to the different groups, independently of whether they finally participated in the intervention or not, and LATE, local average treatment effects, with which we recovered the real impact of the intervention on those finally participating in the project. I don't want to enter too much into the technicalities of the exercise. If I have some luck, it will be published soon, so you can have a look there. But just to reassure you of the consistency of the results, I use information criteria to decide the econometric specification of the model, and I ran multiple robustness checks to ensure that results are consistent. I also verified that the instrumental variable assumptions were met, because we use instrumental variables to estimate the LATE, and because we also relaxed the assumption that effects are homogeneous across individuals' characteristics and dimension of the intervention. We also estimated an heterogeneous treatment effect. I used sharpened Q values to correct for multiple hypothesis testing. And finally, I would like to say that when we will see the heterogeneous effect model, it is true that we cannot talk about causality, because two things: the sample was not stratified, and the NGO, I can understand this, the NGO didn't accept to randomize individuals into tracks or areas of training, because that will be very complicated for them. So saying that, the main question here, did GOPT work? And the answer is yes, it worked. The intervention had a significant impact on employment probability, with an ITT of 30 percentage points and a LATE of 60 percentage points. And this is a very large impact, although still below the regional average for employment and the national average for youth, according to the National Institute of Statistics and AFRISTAT. The intervention was also effective at increasing individuals' income, with an ITT of 57 euros per month and a LATE of 106 euros per month. Again, this is still very far below the average income of a Bissau Guinean worker, which was 332 euros per month at the moment of the intervention. And also you can make the calculation, it didn't lift out of poverty the average household. The project also had the main goal, the main objective was to reduce willingness to emigrate. And this is a concept I can explain further later on if you are interested, but just to say that we consider as being willing to emigrate those individuals that had made arrangements to go and live permanently in another country within the next 12 months. And this willingness to emigrate diminished by 94% after the treatment. But for whom and how did this work? And here I looked into how individuals' observable characteristics interact with the impacts on the outcomes of interest. And I discovered, and this is very interesting for me, that if we wanted to maximize the impact on employment probability, we should target the individuals that were unemployed at the baseline, coming from the poorest households, avoiding those with long job tenure. And this may make sense, but the interesting thing is that if our donors, our development partners, are interested in maximizing income generation, we should target individuals coming from the wealthiest households, but with few years of schooling. And this trade-off is very interesting for me. The impact on willingness to emigrate will be maximized if we targeted the individuals that were the youngest at the beginning of the intervention and showing a high willingness to emigrate. And these are some graphs that I produce in Stata that will be in the publication also. Then there's another way implementing agencies can try to enhance the effectiveness of their intervention, that is improving the design and better tailoring it to the country context. And here, what I saw is that the track 3, the one including incentives for entrepreneurship, was the one dominating, oh no, I have them. Is the one dominating all the others for all the outcomes of interest. But there is no area of training that dominates for all areas of interest, for all outcomes of interest, sorry. Employment probability is higher for those in agriculture and income for those in apiculture. However, this, as I said, there was no random allocation, sample sizes are small, and this is just correlation, no causality. And it was difficult to identify significant differences between tracks or areas of training. Was it worth it? We also should look, and I am surprised that nobody was talking about efficiency in these days, at least in the presentations I was attending. So since we are short of time, I will skip this, but I want to say that lack of efficiency might jeopardize an effective intervention. And as you can see, we were already talking that God maybe was not so efficient at lifting people out of poverty. Here, interesting result. The most efficient track was the track 2, the one with on-the-job training. It had a payback period of 25 months. However, I compared results across a sample of studies. It was difficult to compare because methodological inconsistencies across the different studies, but we can see that God clearly underperformed other interventions. But it's also true that it seems there are some poverty traps reducing the efficiency of active labor market policies. Now the conclusions and recommendations for policy. We can see that vocational and skilled classroom training, on-the-job training, and entrepreneurship promotion are very effective at improving labor market outcomes for vulnerable youths in contexts like the one in Guinea-Bissau. Still, efficiency might be low. We can use targeting of participants to increase efficiency, but be aware that politicians and development partners might be interested in suboptimal targeting and less efficiency in order to accomplish policy goals. For example, favoring the extreme poor. Another way to enhance efficiency that is politically neutral is improving the design of interventions and better tailoring it to the country context, because that does not select some individuals. It's improved efficiency for everyone. But here we need to be aware of the country context. I'm going to say just one thing. TVET vouchers are very effective in the European context, in the EU Youth Guarantee, but in our context, in Guinea-Bissau, they were not. Why? Because people is financially constrained. They cannot really choose the TVET center they want to attend, and maybe they don't have nor the information or the capacity to choose the classroom training, the training that better fits their skills and the labor market opportunities. Then when pursuing several policy objectives, we might be aware that there are trade-offs. We have seen that if we want to maximize impact on employment creation, we should target individuals coming from the poorest households. But for logical reasons that we can discuss later, if we want to maximize income generation, we should target those coming from more wealthy households. The optimization problem is more complex the more policy goals we include in our interventions. That's something to say. I wouldn't assess the effectiveness of an intervention purely based on economic criteria. This might be perverse. In our case, those in agricultural training had the best outlook for employment, but they all ended in self-employment. And this is likely to be lower tier informal self-employment. Then we can question the net impact on decent work gaps. And finally, I finish with this, the link between active labor market policies and the just transition. Agriculture and apiculture were the most effective areas of training. And we should gather further evidence on this interlinkage between activation policies and the just transition. Are there trade-offs between this type of active labor market policies? Secondly, does something work better in the short run but worse in the long run? Maybe traditional ALMP is better in the short run, but in the long run, when climate is changing, maybe the just transition one are better. And finally, now 5 minutes, yes, because I have it here too. Finally, I would like to say, I'm gonna finish now. So I would like to say that we still need to invest on building up the evidence about what, how, and for whom active labor market policies work. Designing a rigorous evaluation is very challenging because sample sizes are typically small. There are methodological issues like imperfect compliance. We need to convince development partners, implementing agencies, that evaluations have a value in themselves. This is everything I wanted to share with you today. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to your feedback, comments, and questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Carlos, and excellent. Thank you. Not probably emphasized by my erroneous indications during. We have plenty of time for questions. I'll open that to the floor first, and if there's anybody, I myself have a few, but if there's anybody, please. And please, can everybody introduce themselves? Just 2 seconds introduction.
Okay, thank you. Evelyn Betza, working on these topics on youth employment programs. I would like to know if you could expand a bit about the training courses. Did the program establish any requirements on quality standards or graduation for the participation in these courses? And did all the participants graduate or some of them drop out?
Yes.
Thank you.
Indeed, all the participants graduate, all of them. But I must say that here I only looked at the men participating in the intervention because there was a challenge that the NGO implementing the intervention. There are several things here. The ones that were in the evaluation, they all graduated, but we didn't assess the impact on female. Why? Because there was a gender quota, and when we did the selection, the original screening, not enough women were registering for the evaluation, so we couldn't randomize them into treatment. All of them got into the program. There was an expansion of the program that didn't enter neither into the evaluation because it was not randomized for the entrepreneurship track. And in that, some of them didn't finish, but I didn't look at those. Then regarding the quality, there was a continuous monitoring where I was actively participating also. And as I say, in the intervention, there was a tutoring, a mentoring. There was a mentoring feature that ensured that quality, apart from the know-how of the NGO doing this, that is an Italian NGO that works in these things all around the world.
Thanks very much. Kate?
Thank you so much, Carlos. I'm Kate. I'm a PhD student at the University of Cambridge. I just wondered if you could expand a bit on the willingness to migrate, if that was purely international migration. And also I'm a bit confused about the 94% finding. Could you expand a bit more on what exactly that was referring to as well?
Okay. Well, we measured willingness to emigrate with a methodology that is normally used in this type of studies, that basically we had 3 questions in our survey. First, we asked people if they would consider to emigrate to another country. Then there was a second question. If they answered yes to this, there was a second question asking them if they have done any preparation to live in another country. And the second question was if they had comply with some of the administrative requirements to go and live permanently in another country within the next 12 months. And these were things like having a visa, the job, things like that. But there are, of course, all questions to people. There was, in this case, there was not verification whether the person really had the visa or not. And what we saw is that among compliers, after the, well, first to say, I didn't say this, but the sample, the control and the treatment sample, subsamples, were balanced in observables. We did a balance check at the baseline. And the willingness to emigrate using this index that could go from 0 to 1 if they answered yes to everything, at the baseline was 0.33 in both groups. In the treatment group, after the project, the reduction of those saying that they had made arrangements to go and live permanently in another country was 94%. So imagine if there were 100 people willing to do that, after the intervention, there were only 6 willing to do that. Something to say regarding that is that indeed, if you look at the literature, Hamori and others in Kenya in a similar experiment found a similar impact, 93%.
Any more questions from the floor? Do we have anything from Karina? Is there anything on? Okay, I mean, yeah, I think I'm curious because it's a very small sample and the effects are huge essentially, and just so the if I understand correctly, also by implications, the baseline, I mean, the non-treated had very low employment probabilities, very low earnings after, or were they 0? Because you seem to talk about as if they were synonymous, the employment rates and so on. Secondly, is how long afterwards were the effects evaluated? When was the?
Okay.
Yeah,
That's easy. That was 6 months after the. Indeed, no, because yeah, that's a good question. Different tracks ended at different time. That's true. So the minimum was evaluated after 6 months after the end of the intervention. But it's true that, for example, the people with the vouchers, they ended up the intervention sooner. The ones in entrepreneurship track, they took more time. They were the ones finishing in July. The other question, I'm not really sure if I got it, but the truth is that the employment creation was created indeed at the extensive margin, because practically nobody was employed when they were participating. So of course, many of them, after doing the on-the-job training, this is my guess because we didn't ask this indeed, they stayed in the company where they were doing the on-the-job training. But it's true that the employment creation is mainly at the extensive margin because many people were not employed. So, but as I said, still below what the National Institute of Statistics estimated as average for youth at the national level, and for those regions of intervention. And also, we only asked if the person was employed, not if they full-time, maybe they were working 1 hour, informal employment. I mean, this could be done much better with more resources, but it was something I just took the opportunity to do with an NGO that was willing to let me do some research.
okay, thanks very much. And I think it's an interesting paper. I look forward to reading it. Indeed. With that, it will take a minute or two to this high-tech solution to shift the computer over to the. So now we're going to, if you like, move back to Tsega Mizgabo, who's this is going to take us through a bit of background, bit of context on the Ethiopian youth employment situation, and to discuss and review youth employment policies in Ethiopia in recent years. So I think if you're
Okay.
ready, we'll let you go.
Okay, thank you. Yes, thank you. Good morning, everybody. And I would like first to express my appreciation to the ILO, IDRC, and include to give me the opportunity to come here and present. I would like also extend to the Commission, I mean the financiers and supporters of in terms of the technical issues of the project, the Partnership for Economic Policy. In gratitude to that, whenever we, they are standard, we have to use their slides in this manner. So I'm going to present the research done by a group of researchers. I am the principal investigator, and it's a review of youth employment policies in Ethiopia. My presentation will follow in this protocol. In the interest of time, I will skip it. Why Ethiopia is the important question. So Ethiopia is a poor agrarian country, but contributing the second largest youth population in Africa, which is also experiencing a huge challenge in terms of youth employment. I would like to highlight two important statistics here. The level of unemployment, youth unemployment is 7.7%, the statistics, the national statistics, which is quite low and fair compared to other countries. But there is also a differentiation between urban and rural areas. The urban areas is quite high, but in rural areas, the under unemployment is prevalent in many ways. So the different statistics show the different estimates. The other important element that I would like to add to the existing statistics is the new entrant youth entrant to the labor market. Every year, 20 million are expected. That's very huge. So this large size of the youth unemployment, underemployment, and the new entrant, they demand urgent and coordinated action, obviously, which cannot be done by the government itself. But there is lack of systematic documentation in terms of evaluation of the already existing policies and programs implemented so far, which makes it very difficult to learn lessons and to understand what works better. So this calls for a systematic review of the various initiatives undertaken in Ethiopia, basically to create a knowledge base of the implications of the different policies, the direct one and as well as the indirect one, to identify which policies hinder or support youth employment programs, as well as inclusive employment opportunities. So with this background, this is a research project that is initiated by the PEP, Partnership for Economic Policy. It was initiated to support the MasterCard Foundation Youth Africa Works, which envisioned to enable 30 million youth of Africa, particularly women, to access to dignified and fulfilling work by 2030, which is around the corner. So Ethiopia is one of the 10 countries in this similar studies. So the objective of this research is basically to conduct comprehensive review of youth employment policies and their impacts, to provide information on key lessons, and provide empirical knowledge and best practices thereof, and identify the key knowledge gaps. So particularly, these are the main objectives or concerns of the research as well. So in doing so, we try to look into the past 20 years of those policies and initiatives, including the research done in terms of impact evaluation, their impact for the past 20 years, and I'm going to present the results. Methodologically, we applied this qualitative approach because the intention or the focus is to understand or to describe and explain and understand the different opinions, perspectives of the stakeholders, including the beneficiaries at different scales and capacity or level. including the institutional policy setting environment. So we collect the data in this manner. It's a standard protocol, but what we did different here is we also looked into the different, the 3 national labor force surveys to generate statistics for the youth labor outcomes and the employment stats of the country. We incorporated also, we differentiated the different youth groups in terms of the focus group discussion. We include the refugees because there are a number of refugees from 4 or 3 countries, mainly the big ones. And there is also this huge IDPs, in internally displaced people, because of the ongoing conflict. So we try to look into their opinions and perspectives as well. We have, in collecting the data, there were some problems, but we managed to come up with measures that can help us in order to, collect the data in a safe and also without compromising the quality of the data and the representation. So this is how we manage it, because the frequent meetings are, I don't know whether it's typical for Ethiopia but it's there annoying really. And from the coming to the key findings from the surveys, we adopt the African Youth Charter, which defines youth in the age range of 15 to 35, which is quite different from that of the ILO because it's 15 to 29. And not only that, because unemployment issue is more focus of in terms of the policy and interventions urban. So we look into that urban area particularly. So the statistics that I'm trying to share is particularly for urban areas. So following the ILO's definition of labor market outcome, we come up with 4 groups, and we reduce it later to 3 groups: the employed, the NEET, and the student. So as you can see, the overall employment, those employed improved slightly over time. But the NEET rate also decreased over time, but the level of recruitment is higher for the men than the women. Overall, the proportion of women in the NEET rate is double that of the men. We try to unpack the different status of those employed, this one. So we disaggregated into these different groups. This permanent, the ratio of the permanent employment is very, very small. And the level of employment in Ethiopia for the youth is dominated by the self-employed. And if we look at the non-wage employment, including contributing unpaid labor for household and family, it is more than 50%, which is huge. But the other important element that we looked into, tried to interested kind of investigating further is this self-employment. Basically, it's considered as a basis for entrepreneurship. But looking at the context of Ethiopia, they are considered as a route out of unemployment. So it includes this straight bending, which is highly affected by COVID. They have no these protections for work, and they are easy to enter and exit in a way. So we consider them as part of the vulnerable employment, which is, I think, quite in line with that of the ILO also. Obviously, the women are underrepresented, but in terms of the overall non-wage employment, the women dominates the proportion. The other important element that we did was because it was part of our job to look into the different policies and programs out there that can affect directly or indirectly the youth employment programs as they are. So as they are, we cluster them into 7 groups. Those that facilitate employability, which affects this supply side, which is the skill gap. There are these programs that address the entrepreneurship, like the demand side. There are policies to protect youth rights. There are also overall economy-wide programs that address employment, where youth employment is part and parcel of it. There are other employment programs for the rural agricultural growth program. There are also policies, although very recent ones, some of them that try to address the vulnerable group, the refugees, as well as the people with disabilities, and the occupational safety also is also there. So we just try to look them in terms of their intentions. So these are more or less the supply side is obviously yes, the employability, but the other ones they try to look into both the demand and supply side. Do they achieve their intentions is the other important element. We try to look into it. And we try to classify it into as they are, because there were like many of them. The list is very huge. So what the key findings here is there is no youth employment, a standalone youth employment policy so far in Ethiopia, which is, I think, important in our perspective. The programs, the youth employment programs and initiatives implemented so far, they are fragmented, and they are implemented by different actors and in a piecemeal approach. And the coordination, the monitoring and evaluation activities are very weak, if not absent. The other important element, maybe it's peculiar to Ethiopian government, I'm not sure though, for other countries, there is this frequent restructuring of the government. So in this sense, in terms of the political agency, in terms of implementing those youth employment programs, there is a huge problem, because the youth employment program is like moving from one ministry to the another ministry, the time of restructuring, like the pendulum, and it's like, so that creates vacuum for follow-up. And also continuity, in most cases, they might be disrupted because the line ministries, they keep changing their duties and responsibilities. And not only creating vacuums, but also it has implications in terms of learning and improving the interventions outcomes. This is how we analyze the data that we collected qualitatively, the in vivo result. I will skip it in the interest of time. But as you can see, the most important concerns or opportunities for different actors of the stakeholders is different. We looked into also the different empirical studies conducted so far for the employment initiatives, youth employment initiatives implemented. We grouped them into two, those initiated by the government and those initiated by or implemented by the NGO and other development partners. So when we looked at the government-initiated programs, obviously there is no formal evaluations. Rather, they rely on periodic regular reports that they compare against their action plan. And we try to understand why is this happening. And from the respondents, what we understand is some of them, quite few, of course, they indicate that there is a budget constraint. But most of them, they indicate that they don't have the culture of allocating budget for that purpose, which is a very huge problem. When it comes to the impact of the interventions studies related to the NGOs and development partners, most of the time, the studies are descriptive in nature. They compare the beginning and end result, which lacks in many ways, because there are confounding factors that affect the outcome. They don't follow the proper impact evaluation protocols, and a few of them, those try to do the control and treatment, which they apply with property score matching. They come up with mixed results. In fact, the coverage is also very, very small, and geographically it's not representative, because Ethiopia is a very complex country, diversified in many ways. And we try to understand here as to the why. And from the respondents, we come to understand that they understand the importance of these rigorous evaluations, but they kind of worry about the implications in terms of their organizational expenses, because there is a new CSO law, maybe I think, I'm not sure, but 5 years ago, it says the operational cost for CSO is 80 to 20, that 20 is operational cost. And then this conducting research is considered as part and parcel of that. So they don't want to take that risk. We looked into the political economy. The list is very long, but in terms of adequacy and inadequacy. So we tend to find that there is a lack of clear targets in terms of implementation of the strategies. For instance, the number of jobs created. There is huge capacity gap at all levels. And in terms of there are only so far 3 youth-focused plans and programs. Sorry, there is for the misspelling. They are designed in a very short period of time. So it's mainly their main target is to consolidate power rather than addressing the problem. There is a lack of inclusiveness. Obviously, it's focused on urban. The rural youth are not getting the attention they require, although they constitute 80% of the youth population, including the pastoralists and the disabled. So the weak intersectoral cooperation is also there. And we'll try to look into also this process of policy formulation, how it has happened. So we understand that youth are their representation or participation is very limited, which is quite important in terms of owning or developing ownership of the programs. Those participated, in fact, because the reporters indicated they are party affiliated, which means they are there into the interest of the party. There is also absence of independent professionals and CSOs participation in designing and implementing. The majority, the youth focus, they are inspired or created as in response to the political crisis. Usually they follow the electoral cycles. There is a very huge duplication of activities, similar activities being implemented by different partners. There is also a lack of information to the youth. The last one is a summary of that. To conclude, yeah, we understand that there is although there are a number of various initiatives undertaken by various organizations, but there is no standalone employment policy, which lacks in terms of focus. The continuous restructuring of the government also prevents the follow-up and continuation of the programs and initiatives already implemented. The youth implement initiatives. We have this youth revolving fund, the youth development package. They're just designed to kind of putting out the fire, because there are youth issues following these elections. And they are poorly designed. They lack also the rigorous evaluation and monitoring mechanisms. So there are duplication of efforts, but not only that, but they are not interrelated to each other. So the takeaway, and maybe for the ILO could be much of interest, is in terms of this developing a separate youth employment policy. It can be packaged, because there are a few African countries that in line with that. And that also should try to understand the interests of the different groups of the youth, the women, the refugees, and the disabled. There is also a need for coordination and consolidation of structures in the interest of the use of resources in terms of its effectiveness and efficiency, and to avoid duplication of the efforts, like reinventing the wheel can be also. The other is we try to look into the digital economy. It can provide a huge opportunity for the youth, but it needs a very huge investment in terms of the IT infrastructure, which is also absent. In terms of this mismatch, particularly the youth and the graduate youth, the skill and demand, we try to come up with revisiting the education system in terms of including entrepreneurial values, because the rural sector, in terms of the non-farm, there is huge opportunity, but people want to move out that. And the other one is volunteerism in terms of acquiring skills. In terms of future research, we because the existing ones are limited in terms of geographical coverage. Quasi-experimental research that addresses diversified geographical coverage, and also to understand the attributes between the gap between the implementation and the intention of the programs. And because there are these redundancies, then mapping or conducting inventories of the programs that exist so far to create a knowledge base for informed decisions or further interventions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Questions, comments? Please, Karina.
Thank you very much. I think it was very interesting presentation, and very much reflects what we've seen while doing the analysis of the school to work transitions in selected countries in Africa, including Ethiopia. And although we didn't really have a chance to do the field work to look into the existence of impact evaluation of existing strategies and policies, which have the bits and pieces of the elements of youth employment, I think that's very much what we've seen is very similar to your findings, is that the policies are quite fragmented. There's no coherence in them, and if we say there's no comprehensive framework for youth employment as a distinct strategy or as a part of the national employment strategy, something which the ILO is monitoring as part of the 8.B.1 SDG indicator.
Mhm.
And my question may be, it may be a bit of a $1 million question, but based on your experience with the country and the finding of your research, and provided that the policy is actually implemented, would you think that for the context of Ethiopia, you would recommend having a standalone, a separate policy, or more of a comprehensive framework spread around other development, different development policies, like, for example, youth being an integral part of the youth employment being an integral part of the national employment strategy, youth employment as part of the agricultural development strategy, digital development strategy? What would be your recommendation, so to say, to the government? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. By the way, the government listens to the ILO recommendations and therefore, for some reason. It's a contested though. I mean, having this use standalone employment policy might not solve the problem, given the context, the fragmentation, and the lack of focus in terms of the youth employment issues. But our view as a team is it might not be a policy per se, but some sort of focus should be there. Someone has to, take the lead, because the Ministry of Agriculture is doing something, the Ministry of Urban is doing something, the Ministry of Industry, you name it. But the agency or the ministry in charge is now the Women's and Social Affairs. And the Women's and the Social Affairs is the wheel on the, car. The drivers are. So that is the big problem now. So if there is a program, maybe it could be under the Ministry of Planning. It doesn't matter where, but there should be a concerted, focused effort, because it's very huge. If you look at below 35, it's 70%. percent of this 100 something population. If we look at this age range, it's about 45%. It's very huge in terms of the population. So I think the ministry is currently revising the youth policy, the existing youth policy. It was there for since 24, that is for 20 years. But in this process, I think it's a good opportunity for the ILO to intervene and, you know, kind of push so this program or policy can be there. Obviously, the implementation matters most. Yeah, thank you. I hope.
Thank you very much. That was really nice. Yeah, so another. I just a quick comment, and this issue of monitoring and evaluation. I mean, we looked at 7 countries in 7 African countries recently on the youth employment policy, and you know, all of them, this lack of monitoring and evaluation was the major issue. Possibly to some extent, with some exception, we didn't look at South Africa, but South Africa is rather a case apart in the African context and has some very different. So without further ado, let's pass the means and the word, as it were, over to Ariane Delanoy from SALDRU in Cape Town, who's going to talk to us about the guarantee approach and the specific pilot they've been implementing to support NEET in South Africa. I know, but we reached you.
Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you to the organizers of the forum for giving me the opportunity to talk about this exciting piece of work. It's really great to be here, to have an opportunity to share lessons, and I'm really looking forward to receiving some input and some considerations back from the audience, actually. I have to admit that I'm feeling slightly intimidated by the several mentions of we need impact evaluations and randomized control trials. And while we would have said all of that as SALDRU before starting this piece of work, we've been humbled by the experience of being asked by national government to walk the path with them and to help them think about what a comprehensive approach to support youth employment would actually look like, both from a policy point of view and from an implementation point of view on the ground. And I think trying to build those bridges between integrated policy approaches and actual rigorous implementation on the ground in communities that are severely resource constrained has really been an incredibly humbling experience. So I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts about that. So just as a preface, this is not the result of a rigorous impact evaluation. This has been a piece of implementation research that's come on the back of decades, actually, of quantitative analysis looking at what youth unemployment and a cohort of young people who are not in education, employment, or training in South Africa looks like. Looking at and conducting qualitative research with young people from ethnographies to smaller pieces of research across the country, different provinces, different cohorts of young people, and a systematic overview of policies on youth unemployment and employment, and then ultimately being asked by national government to try and see if we could walk the journey with them. So SALDRU runs an annual analysis of quarterly labor force survey data to try and understand what this cohort of young people who are NEET looks like, and what their different profiles are, very much along the lines of what we heard yesterday as well, in terms of trying to understand who we are solving for before we begin to solve. Despite numerous state and non-state interventions implemented over the past decade and more, we see that trend of young people who is NEET has not improved. In fact, it's increased. We're looking at 33.3% of young people who are NEET, and that's over 3.4 million young people between the ages of 15 to 24. If we were to use the full South African definition of youth up to the age of 35, we're looking at over 9 million nationally of young people who are NEET. And so we've actually seen a steady increase of that proportion over time. There's a bit of a dip here during the COVID years, but we're assuming that has something to do with actual data collection rather than anything else. The message we've been trying to build since about 2015, when we worked on a consolidation of what the situation of young people in post-apartheid South Africa was actually like. The message we've been trying to bring towards policy and implementation is that these are young people, not only these young people, but young people in South Africa face multiple challenges that play out in their lives all at the same time. So these are not young people who are only unemployed. They're unemployed out of the schooling system with low levels of education, and not just low levels of education, but low levels of skill, many of whom live in income poverty. When we look at general household survey data of 2021, we see that close to 70% of them live below the upper bound poverty line, which is the equivalent of about 60 euro per person per month. They also live, and we'll see that just now, they live often in areas on the peripheries of urban centers where opportunities and services and access to services is very low. They face high levels of interpersonal violence and community level violence, and so on. So we're looking at young people that are dealing with multiple challenges and barriers that reinforce one another in keeping them excluded out of the labor market and the education system. And when they are out of the labor market and the education system, they become relatively invisible to the systems. We've conducted this policy review as well. Actually, when a young person becomes NEET, there's no real clarity on who is responsible for them from the position of the state, because they're not in the education system. So it's not basic education or higher education. They're not in the labor market. So it's not the Department of Employment and Labor. So who is it actually? They're falling between the cracks. And so we built this case that really you do need to move towards a much more comprehensive approach to supporting young people to try and avoid this kind of invisibility in the systems. Okay, so who are we looking at? We're looking at over 3.4 million young people, as I said. Close to 50% of them are searching unemployed. In other words, they're indicating in the national surveys that they're willing to work, they're available to work, and they're looking for work. We definitely also take into account that additional 20% of young people who indicate they are willing to work, they are available to work, but they've given up looking for work. That's still a proportion of young people, a sizable proportion of young people that has an orientation towards the labor market. It's not that they're not willing to engage with the labor market. And what's important actually is when you look at this over time is that discouragement has gone down. Searching unemployment has actually seen a statistically significant increase over time. So we're looking at more young people that are searching for access to the labor market, but are not finding that access. Surprisingly, in South Africa, often when we think about young people who are NEET, we think they are mostly in rural areas, very far removed from opportunities. 60% of young people who are NEET in South Africa live in urban areas. When we talk about these young people, we need to take the apartheid urban planning into account. These, as I said, are often young people that were literally flung, or their families were flung on the peripheries of cities in communities that weren't built to be cohesive communities and supportive communities. So there's a particular context to this urban environment. And what we're also seeing is that the majority of these young people are out of education and out of the labor market with low levels of education. This here is quite a significant shift. While we saw that close to 60% of them had less than a matric, that's the high school, the final high school examination in South Africa, that's gone down, and we've seen a significant increase in young people who are NEET with a high school examination. Result that's quite worrisome, because for a long period of time, we saw that even though the labor market is very unwelcoming for young people in South Africa, at least matric had some protective power. It was still a signal, a signaling mechanism towards employers that these were young people that had some level of skill. And so the preference of employers has been to hire youth with a matric rather than those without. But it looks like that matriculation result or exam is losing its protective power in the labor market as well. What's important is that close to 80% of these are new entrants into the labor market. In other words, they've never worked before. It's a bit of a misleading term, as I'm sure you all know, because it's not that new of an entry into the labor market. Of those who are new entrants in the labor market, 42% have been looking for work for more than 3 years. This is significant because it implies on the side of young people, a resilience and a willingness to continue to look for work, even though there is no work opportunity for them. And so what we're looking at is this vicious cycle of continued socioeconomic exclusion where young people are facing multiple types of deprivation all at the same time. And our colleagues in psychology talk about this as a cycle of social causation and social drift, where that situation increases mental ill health. And so we're seeing, and we see this when we look at things as the National Income Dynamic Study in South Africa, young people who are NEET and who are NEET for extended periods of time from low income households, when they remain NEET for long periods of time, they are at a higher risk of clinical depression and a range of other mental ill health factors that ultimately render them impossible to take up an opportunity or stick with that opportunity, even if it were available. And so there's a range of additional references we can look at. And so what we started building on the back of all of this evidence was a message towards the policy environment that it isn't this kind of needlepoint intervention where we try to only match a young person, to an opportunity is actually insufficient to break this continued cycle. Because even when we place one young person in one job opportunity, they're very often, or a training opportunity, they're very often not able to stick with that opportunity. They drop out, which is a significant loss of investment on the side of the individual, their families, and the state. And even when they complete that opportunity, at the end of that opportunity, there is no automatic stream through to the next opportunity. So there's no progressive pathway to a sustainable livelihood. Rather, it's this kind of stop and go and this continued churn that really requires an enormous amount of resilience and resources on the side of young people and families that don't have this. So I'm moving on quite quickly through all of this background because I want to get to what we've ultimately gotten to. We built the, I suppose, advocacy case to say towards our policy environment that really we needed a more concerted, coherent and comprehensive approach to young people who are not in education, employment or training. That we needed to combine both programmatic interventions with a national policy approach. If I would have summarized the national youth employment policy environment in South Africa, it would have been very much along the lines of what Seka just presented. There's a high degree of fragmentation. Different departments are responsible for different pieces of the pipeline, and no real connection of the systems from the perspective of a young person. So how do we begin to deal with this? We speak about this now as a basic package of support for young people who are not in education, employment, or training. That's because the term youth guarantee caused a little bit of a panic among the policy environment, because it is very difficult to guarantee within a South African context that young people will be able to be connected to a training opportunity or a labor market opportunity. So the European Union Youth Guarantee, on paper, guarantees that young people who leave the education system or the labor market will be reconnected to an education opportunity or a labor market opportunity within 4 months of leaving the system. That's quite a tricky promise to make within the South African context, but what we can guarantee is that at least we try to reach out proactively to these young people who have been disconnected and floating through the system for extended periods of time, who because of that have lost faith in the systems and in services, and that we try to reconnect them at least to some support services. So we combine the design of a programmatic intervention that offers high-touch, face-to-face support to young people. It reaches out to these young people proactively. And so you'll hear some of these terms come back that are some of the principles of the youth guarantee. In other words, we don't assume that young people will automatically walk through the door of a basic package of support office because they've been so discouraged and disappointed in their communities for extended periods of time. We have young people who are mobilizers, kind of our feet on the street, who go out and hang out where young people hang out and invite them through the door of a basic package of support site, where we offer them a coaching trajectory with a trained youth coach that will work with them to complete a holistic assessment. Where are they at? What are their needs? What are their challenges? But also what are their aspirations, so that when we begin to solve for a reconnection to education, training, or the labor market, we do that in line with what their, as much as we can, with what their aspirations and their skills level are. So we try and take some of that the mismatch out of this situation that we see young people finding themselves in. We work with them to develop a longer term action plan and break that into short term steps. And so we try to be as well targeted and multifaceted as possible. That multifaceted approach is quite important. We know that we're working with young people who may have dropped out of the schooling system at the age of 18 before completing matric, who may have become young caregivers, and who therefore can't immediately solve for their next best step. So how do we solve for multiple barriers that are playing out at the same time? But also, how do we support their agency, this kind of soft skill problem solving aspect that was mentioned quite a bit yesterday as well? How do we begin to support a young person in that? It's not a needlepoint intervention in that it provides follow-up support. So we understand that young people may take up an opportunity, but may not necessarily stick with it. There are factors that push or pull them back off a trajectory. And at that point, we want them to be able to come back through the door and take up coaching again, if that is what they need. And we connect them to local services and opportunities at the community level. We use the lessons from that programmatic intervention to feed it into the national policy environment. We work closely and in alignment with a fairly recent development within the policy environment, which is the Presidential Youth Employment Intervention, that thankfully has taken up the responsibility to try and coordinate these different departments and get them to work across the silos rather than within their silos. It's a very long process. It's been, as I said, a very humbling experience because none of this is straightforward and quick. All of these departments are set in their own way of doing things. They've got their own KPIs. They've got their own funding approaches. And so these interventions aren't fast. We do have a theory of change. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because I actually want to get to the results. So we begin from the assumption that young people are faced with multiple deprivations as they seek to transition from learning to earning. They create various and additional barriers that make it difficult for young people to find and stick with learning or earning opportunities. And that in itself leads to discouragement, poor mental health and well-being, and a situation of social drift. We've got a two-pronged approach to an intervention. I'll come back to the slide just now. One is, as I said, this kind of face-to-face approach that proactively reaches out to young people who are in need and provides this coaching journey. But because we realize that we are working in communities that are, as I said, severely under-resourced, but are also really still facing the legacy of apartheid, right? These weren't communities that were meant to have social cohesion and a supportive structure. We realize that we can't only work with young people, because if we work with young people and we refer them to services and an environment that is still unwelcoming and unsupportive, we're only going to feed the cycle of discouragement. So we invite local service providers into a community of practice where we invite them to begin to problem solve collaboratively from the perspective of a young person. If you are an ECD center, are you really only serving young children, or are you also there to serve young mothers who need childcare opportunities so that they can look for work? So two-pronged approach. We gather evidence on both of these pieces, but I'm going to report only on the outcomes for the piece on how young people who are in need have been doing. Our main aim, we rolled out 6 pilot sites across several provinces in the country. We conducted in-depth analysis of what these particular areas looked like. We mapped services, we mapped the needs youth cohort, and we rolled out the intervention. Because we knew this was very much implementation research in a messy environment. And really our main aim was to get to proof of concept. Is it possible to reach these young people? Is it possible to invite them onto a coaching trajectory? And is it possible to begin to see some shifts in how they are doing? We combined quantitative data collection at baseline. So I know, not a rigorous RCT, pre-session 1, which is before the coaching is taken up, and post-session 3, we've got a series of coaching sessions. Session 3 is where they develop their longer-term action plan. But we also conducted standardized qualitative data collection across the different sites with a randomly sampled sub-cohort in each of these groups so that we could look at whether or not the quantitative and the qualitative data speak to one another. I'm going to move through this so that we can actually get to some of the findings. So what do we see pre and post session 3? So we've got a number of indicators that we collect data on before a young person takes up a session and after they complete session 3. the Cantrell's ladder is one of the mechanisms that is actually also used within the rollout of the European Union Youth Guarantee. It asks a young person to indicate where they feel they find themselves on a ladder of 0 to 10, with 0 being the bottom of where is my life right now and 10 being the optimal position. We see that 54.2% of young people place themselves on the bottom 4 ranks of that ladder before taking up the coaching session. 14.8% at the top ladder. And so really what you want to see is a decrease in these lowest levels of indicators and an increase towards the right. And that is exactly what we are seeing. We're asking young people about their sense of being supported. And these are response options that range from I am isolated and alone, I feel disconnected from the people around me, to, on the other hand here, I consistently feel connected to the people around me. We see a decrease in the worst of these responses and an increase towards the right-hand side again. Yesterday, someone presented on young people not having a sense of not having any friends and not having any connection. We ask young people about peer support. Response options range from I don't have any friends, I would like to have friends, but it's very hard for me, to I have friends I can trust and rely on when I need them. And again, we see decreases in these lower ranks and a significant increase on the right-hand side. And what is really encouraging is that we see the quantitative responses reflected in the qualitative data that is collected randomly from young people across the different sites. Young people telling us, I didn't know where I was going in life, what I was going to do. I didn't know where to start. It was a whole blank page for me. I know I need to hurry up. Before I met Basic Package of Support, I would be at home in my bed. The program is actually a thing for me to get up in the morning. It gets me excited. We're applying at colleges now. And so this plays out across the sites and among both young women and young men. Young women saying there wasn't any movement in my life, there was no one to talk to, that little bit of support and guidance was not there. Oops, there we go. We're asking people how they feel about themselves. And again, this ranges from there is nothing about my life that is good to I know where I'm going with my life. We see decreases in the worst and slight increases in the better positions. The GAD is a scale. It's used to identify generalized anxiety disorder among people. We asked that question pre-session 1 and post-session 3. 37.1% of young people were rated or scored in the possible generalized anxiety disorder score, and so indicating further evaluation and support needed, with a significant decrease to 22% once they have completed session 3. So these are responses for young people who have completed both session 1 and session 3, right? So it's a small panel that we've put together. Again, we see this coming through in the qualitative work. Before BPS, I was very depressed. I couldn't do anything by myself. Before BPS, I was feeling small. When you talk to me, I was feeling angry too quickly. I was like a heavy man with depression. I was feeling lonely, wounded, feeling as if I'm abandoned. So we were really seeing some really serious mental ill health and feelings of isolation among these young people. And we're seeing the shift where the coaches are able to begin to feel young people like they are in control and they can cope with some of the challenges they're facing in life. And again, I'm going to go quite fast through this, but you see the similar trends here, decreases in the worst areas and increases in the more positive ones. Young people indicating Basic Package of Support is like a place of recovery. I will continue to try until I get something. And this one I think is quite important. We know that South Africa faces with incredible levels of interpersonal violence. And we see this coming through the qualitative data consistently, young people explaining that they did not know how to engage with others, did not know how to talk to someone, feeling like they had a lot of anger, but actually learning how to do that while working through the coaching sessions with young people. We also know that these are young people, as I said, that place very low levels of trust in the services that are available to them because they've been feeling like they've been let down severely. Pre-session 1, 25.8% of young people said, I'm not going to any of the services in my community because I know I won't be helped. Only 9.6% said there are a variety of services in my community that are helpful and that I would use. And again, we see really significant decreases in these worse areas of trust in services and increases towards the right. So a growing trust in services that are available. And this, I think, is quite an interesting graph. We did not, our main aim with basic package of support is not actually to immediately connect young people to a learning or a work opportunity. Our main aim is to build resilience, well-being, and ultimately bring them closer to the labor market. But so progressively, as young people move through these coaching sessions, they would have all been NEET at the start of the program, because that is one of the criteria to enter the program. And we see a consistent decrease in the NEET status and an increase in what we call EAT. So they are in education or employment or training opportunities as the sessions progress. So we're seeing increases in indicators of well-being, and we're seeing increases in this kind of connection to opportunities. I know my time is up, so I'm going to move to, I'm going to move to the last question. So where are we now? And one of the questions we get from all of the development partners is, how are you going to scale up? Because this is high intensity, high costs, and it takes time, and we don't have time. And we keep on trying to explain that we've wasted over 20 years since the transition to a democratic South Africa, and that we haven't really managed to see any shifts. So we need a little bit more time to maybe try and do things differently and more comprehensively. We continue to work in alignment with the Presidential Youth Employment Intervention, but that is, of course, a temporal situation, right? We are heading into elections next year. We have no idea what the presidency will look like next year, and whether there will be continued support for this kind of approach. We're exploring who would be the departmental home? This question we heard earlier as well. Who needs to take responsibility for this? Is it the Department of Employment or Labor? Is it the Department of Higher Education or Training? Is it social development? And how do we then avoid it becoming yet another silo if it lands in one particular department? Which department can hold the others accountable? It's very difficult. Can we look at mainstreaming? But how do we mainstream? We have a national youth policy, which really lacks implementation and doesn't have the mandate to hold other departments accountable. So where do we go from here? And what do we do in terms of this question of scale up? One of the next steps we do realize we need to take is that of an impact evaluation, but also of a better understanding of pathways for subgroups of youth. So while we know that some young people will need very high intensity support, there will be others at certain times of their lives that may find connections more easily. And so can we understand what kind of dosage of the intervention is needed for what profile of young people? And therefore, can we better target, which would allow us to better allocate resources, right? But that's not an easy question to answer, because it also plays out over time. So this is one of the next pieces we're looking at. And then in line with the message we heard yesterday is, of course, we know this is a supply side intervention. We've got to close the gap towards the demand side and try and bring employers on board and understand what their recognition of this kind of work would be in terms of supporting young people once they are connected to opportunities. Okay.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'll allow one quick question and then, but this is a really nice segue into the last bit. So we'll come back to that. But are there any specific questions, comments on the presentation here? Please go ahead.
Thanks, Ariana, for the presentation. My name is Annika Altaf. I'm from Include. Maybe just a comment on I have a lot of questions. A lot of it resonates also with the work that we've been doing at Include, but also for my PhD research on extreme poverty. And the holistic approach that you're talking about is also something that comes back when you're trying to deal with people living in extreme poverty, especially that mental aspect. And one of the arguments that you always hear from policymakers or programmers is that but it's so intensive. We can't do this. But there are quite a few programs that have done this, the famous graduation models. And the costs of exclusion are much, much higher than investing in these types of programs. So I would very much like to urge you to have that discussion and not get discouraged by it's too costly. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. I mean, one of the questions we're looking at is this kind of cost benefit analysis. You know, what does it cost to continue this level of exclusion to the individual, to the family, and to the state? The problem is there, and I know we're not allowed to say it, but the problem is that we don't necessarily have the right kind of data to build that argument. You know, what is the cost of this kind of long-term exclusion? And what is the cost of creating a different, because really what it is about is how do you create a different kind of society where you rebuild social fabric and you rebuild inclusiveness. And so that I would love to have the conversation about like how do we build it? Because you're right, it is the argument we need to have. We're looking at all of these kind of high level, low touch interventions. And the message we keep giving is, okay, but who are you leaving behind? Who are you scaling up for? It is only going to drive this kind of inequality within the country further. Exactly. And ultimately, then who are you creating a society for? But it is an incredibly difficult message to give. So I'm keen to hear what methods we can use to continue to build that kind of advocacy work, because really that is what it is, right?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. I'd like to bring the discussion a bit more general, also starting with Ariane, but each of the three presentations have looked at rather different areas of youth employment policy from a micro level impact evaluation to this more general view of youth employment policy, and then this let's say guarantee, basic package of support approach from South Africa. And it raises a number of issues. I mean, one thing that came up was the definition of young people. Maybe that's a less important issue. I personally think it's important to go beyond the traditional high income definition of 15, 24-year-olds, and at least to go to 29. In Africa, the African Union uses up to 35, and that's this. There are different views about that. Maybe that's possibly a less important issue than this more general one of designing approaches which are comprehensive on the one hand, but at the same time tailored to the specific obstacles and recognition of the different and specific obstacles facing young people, which leads me a bit. And then there's the sort of associated issue. What is the issue really about employability, or is it about creating enough decent work opportunities for young people? And that brings me to my pet subject. I'm when we come to Nobel economics prize winners, I'm much more Angus Deaton than what's her name, Esther Duflo. So I like to think that I see the value of a randomized controlled trials in their context. They tend to be, they are the gold standard in a sense, but one has to be very careful of the information content one gets from whatever type approach one takes to monitoring and evaluation. And one of the things is randomized controlled trials, if done very well, have strong internal validity. That doesn't mean that the results can be extended to, and there are a number of other. I could talk for hours about that, but I think it's important that we recognize, particularly with these large scale programs, like for example, Youth Guarantee in Europe. How do you do a randomized controlled trial? We've applied some difference in difference methods in that case, and discontinuity design and so on. So these quasi-experimental approaches in that, because when the program impacts the whole environment, where's how do you randomize and control? Where do you get ways. Yeah. But anyway, sorry. Yeah, I won't. So I'd like the panelists to comment. And then again, this last presentation also touched upon this issue. What is it the program should be trying to do? And this idea of the sort of mental health and so on, this sort of the problems that, again, this sort of multiple barriers that young people face. What is it that should, and so then how should we be assessing them in terms? So maybe each of the panelists, I would start with Ariane, and then we go along and have some comments from you each if you have something to say. So please.
So the question is, how should we be assessing?
Well, any of the issues, anything as you wish.
So I mean, as we began to think about, okay, what would an intervention look like? And because we had to be true to our own point that we needed to try and intervene in multiple areas of life, and policy making and implementation all at the same time, it became almost impossible to think about a randomized control trial. And also then there were the ethical questions, frankly, about randomization in community. How do you decide in a community that's been so excluded for such extended periods of time already, where we see these high levels of mental ill health among young people? How do you, and of course we could have made this a staggered intake and all of that, but it was very clear that we couldn't immediately think through a randomized control trial approach. And also we wanted to spend the effort and the energy on grappling with the on-the-ground program and feeding the lessons of that work almost instantly back into that national policy environment, because there was a real momentum in the political economy of the country where the presidency put its weight behind this and said, we want to do this collaboratively. So yeah, I hope that is one piece of that.
Well, this is the eternal debate, no? I think how many times have we talked about this? I like it anyhow, but okay. I said yesterday, for example, to something that was commented by Louis Fox, that there is not a silver bullet. Same here. There are no silver bullets. I mean, we need everything. We need external validity from survey analysis. We need qualitative evidence to understand motivations and other more qualitative things. And we need randomized control trials at the small scale interventions to identify what works under some context and a scenario. But we cannot rely only on one of the tools. I will say, of course, I will be completely intimidated by, even if they are paying me $1 million to do a randomized control trial with something like the EU Youth Guarantee. I mean, it's like, it's going to fail for sure. But what we can do is to apply randomized control trials or other quasi-experimental methods in a smaller scale interventions to get some sound evidence. The ethical questions, this again, eternal debate. But for example, in that case, I don't know because I don't know the context, but do you have spots for all the people? Because if they are not, for me, this is my argument. When I go to talk with policymakers, and honestly, they never listen to me. But my argument is, yeah, do we have enough spots for everyone? Because if we don't have, and this is our target population, randomization is the most democratic way. Everybody gets a chance to participate. Now, if we have resources and capacity to serve everybody, I wouldn't say, let's do a randomization, traditional, but maybe you can do phase-in randomization. Maybe this year, this cohort, next year, another cohort. So there are always ways. I mean, except with these super large scale things that I don't even know how they could be, but I'm still finishing my PhD. So maybe in 10 years time, I give you an answer. Thank you.
Thank you. I think in terms of this methodological issue, I don't have a different view. I think we kind of share background in some sense, some way. But when the question whether the issue of employability or access to decent and fulfilling work, we face that challenge as well during the data collection time. So when we talk about decent and fulfilling job, they were like, what are you talking? There are no jobs available. So the issue at the table now is employability. So there are two ways in this case. Policymakers, they are still looking for quick answer to the issue on the table. For instance, the minimum wage legislation is on the table, the upper house in the parliament for the last 3 or 4 years. The main argument that they raise, the discussants we have from the parliament, they said it discourages the investor. So we want to implement as much as possible, regardless of the quality. So we don't care about that. Let's put it on the table and sell it on the table. So when it comes to Ethiopia, the concern now is employability, not really the access. Although the MasterCard initiative is access to decent and fulfilling jobs. So the first step is getting the job and then building on that. In terms of this methodological issue, I think there are two separate issues. The monitoring and evaluation issue is very huge. It's very huge. It's, I can say, absent in different forms. So I think there needs, I don't know the modality, but there needs an intervention there. Otherwise, implementing something, not understanding what's happening, how these outcomes are there at the end of the program is very difficult. And the different opinions and perspectives by the government offices and also the development partners is a bit worrisome. For instance, probably the CSO law might come up as a result of lack of understanding of the importance of this monitoring and evaluation, and they just put it on the operational expenses. So those issues are very important, even if we are talking employability. But still, what I'm feeling is, I think in terms of this data management, recording, and a bit of exercise on this monitoring and evaluation, at least to be aware, is very, very crucial, because they are the first step, whether to employability or to access, or let's say to envision in the context of Ethiopia, decent and fulfilling jobs. That's how I see it. But the concern in Ethiopia now, currently, is employability. And it's going down terribly because of the many elements in it, politically and economically.
Anybody from the floor would like to intervene?
Oh, sorry, can I?
Yeah, please. Go.
Sorry. By the way, I would like to hear your opinions, because there is a national conference for dissemination to be done in Ethiopia in January. So the inputs and the opinions and reflections are quite important, because just I'm presenting it as the international platform before disseminating. Although the reports are all concluded, there are another 3 reports, a policy analysis and the policy brief, including the scale of measurement. But to enrich those reports, I think I would like to get your feedbacks, even if it's online, if not possible here. Thank you.
I think, sorry, go ahead.
Maybe Niall, just one a bit of an unfair question to at least Tsega and Ariana, because you both were struggling with who should be responsible, which department or how to do that. So I'm just bouncing it back. Who do you think should be responsible?
If we knew, I wouldn't have asked the question, right? Frankly, I'm really not entirely sure. We know that the initiative can't continue to live within the presidency, because that's not a policy-making body, actually. I think the drive from within that environment is correct, because that is the one way of getting that kind of overarching approach and move away from fragmentation, and at least holding departments accountable for delivering on a collective outcome. I think in a South African context, the Department of Social Development would not be a bad place, because their you have the responsibility for young people, for everybody. So it doesn't then become limited only to the working age population. It would also be relevant for a 17-year-old that leaves the schooling system, and who wouldn't necessarily be expected to immediately stream into the labor market. So perhaps, but then there is less of a, I suppose, an affinity with that question of the labor market. So the other alternative is the Department of Employment and Labor, but then they would really need to be empowered and capacitated to think through that pipeline, because it is the transition piece, right, from learning to earning. So I don't have an immediate answer for you, but I would love to hear where it has landed in other parts of the world. I mean, I understand, at least, I suppose the encouraging piece is that I know that also within the European Union and the member states, the same discussions have played out, right? So it isn't only a question of South Africa.
No, certainly not. And within the Dutch government, there is a youth ambassador, which is a person that kind of tries to align the youth employment work within the different departments, but is also an advocate for that. So if a department isn't doing anything about it, then that person has the authority to kind of vouch for that.
And can I respond to that? So sorry.
Perhaps because we're running out of time now.
I will have something meaningful and relevant to
And
yes, to contribute to that question. The country where I'm working now, that is Timor-Leste, and where I have been advising the government for 2 years almost, now created a ministry for coordinating social affairs, for example. It's another area, but it was created, and there is also a ministry for coordinating economic issues. They don't work. What can I say? I mean, normally in context of fragility, the public sector works not very well. I don't know how it will be in an European country like the Netherlands, but those things are done. In my opinion, they only absorb public resources that could go to implementing policies for people, and it's just creating more portfolios to people that is in the coalition. That's my honest opinion, and I do agree with all the thing about monitoring and evaluation. For example, in Timor-Leste, we did, and there is an ILO report about active labor market policies for the youth in Timor-Leste. No monitoring and evaluation at all. That was one of the main findings. Why? They don't want monitoring. They don't want evaluation, because we will say that most of the things are not working, but not because they cannot work, because the way they are implemented. So sorry if I was, but it's I get emotional. Sorry, I get emotional.
Thank you. I think there is because if there is serious monitoring and evaluation, there comes accountability and responsibility. Probably the political aspect might outweigh than the benefit. In terms of the question, I mean, I don't know. It's very difficult. In the discussions we had, we talked to the youth representatives, and they want to have the youth ministry just for the youth. Will it be feasible in the context of the existing political and governmental systems? I really doubt that, because there are ABCs that they should learn. Currently, the Ministry of Women and Social Affairs is in charge of the youth, because there is a state minister, and that ministry could, because it was continuing for the last maybe 10 years, empowering that ministry could work, because they have already at least the basis of those elements and pieces and bits. But there is a conflict of interest, because different ministries want to say we are working for the youth because it's attached with resources, particularly from the donors and development partners. The second obvious one, I think it's pretty much similar to South Africa, the Ministry of Labor, which is 2 years old, Ministry of Labor and Skill. They might also be a good candidate, but I prefer if empowered, not like calling for meeting once the agenda is set and stuff like that. The Ministry of Women and Social Affairs with the State Minister, I think they can work well. That's just an opinion. Yeah.
I'm sure we can continue this discussion. In fact, we started to touch upon some of the more fundamental issues, Shani, and I'm very glad for that. We have the rest of the day and the coffee break and so on to continue with these discussions. But these are really, I think, the important issues that we start to think and to discuss. But I'd just like to end with a round of applause for our great participants. So thank you very much, and may it long continue over coffee.
The coffee break is where it was yesterday, down here.